the Indian people are in somewhat of a dilemma today. 150 years ago, you took a very proud and very independent people, and they were placed on an enclave of land and basically reduced to the status of children, entirely deemed incapable of taking care of themselves. And in the past 100 years, it's been very hard to transcend that stigma.
Welcome to Yonder Lies, unpacking the myths of Jackson Hole. I'm Hannah Haberman.
And I'm Jesse Bryant.
And we're excited to be back with you again for our second episode of the series.
It's been awesome getting this project up and running, and we just wanted to say thank you to everyone for all your support, feedback, and encouragement so far.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Indigenous pasts and presents of Jackson, the state of Wyoming, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Oof. It's a pretty big topic there, hon.
It really is, Jess. And I think it's a really, really important one. And one that's been overlooked in stories about the U.S. for way too long. And as you can maybe imagine, we've gotten so much good information and had so many thought-provoking, powerful interviews with different people that we've decided to break this topic into 2 episodes. We've roughly divided it into 2 themes, past and present.
In some ways, there's not really a way to separate the two.
Of course. The past informs the present informs the past, and the tension between traditional and contemporary life feels especially relevant when talking about Native experiences. But we figured working within some sort of chronology might help us tell this story. Today we'll be focusing on the myths around the history of Indigenous peoples in Jackson Hole, and the creation of the reservations they now call home. We'll also be diving into 2 very important Supreme Court cases, both which have their roots here in Wyoming, that have shaped the relationship between treaties, land use, and the hunting rights of tribal communities.
Yeah, I'm excited. The episode that will follow this one will explore the contemporary issues facing Indigenous people today. We've got some really great interviews lined up, from folks leading the charge on bison reintroduction on the Wind River Reservation, to a leader combating the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, to folks working at the intersection of the outdoor industry, tribal sovereignty, and healing.
We also want to recognize that both Jesse and I are not Native American. We're white. And for that reason, we've tried to integrate as many Native voices and Native experts into our research and interviews as possible.
Today, we'll hear archival audio from a Shoshone Métis man named Clyde Hall, who at the time was a juvenile judge with the Tribal Council on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation in Idaho. Clyde is currently the Executive and Cultural Director of the Naraya Cultural Preservation Council, which works to support Native American people and cultures of the Great Basin Plateau.
Later on in this episode, we'll also hear from Gerald Torres, an acclaimed global scholar of environmental law, critical race theory, and federal Indian law, and a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's also an adjunct professor of law at Yale Law School. We're really excited. But before we get started, we think it's important to get a couple things on the table, just to get everyone on the same page.
There are a lot, and we mean a lot, of myths about Native American people. And not just myths, but false myths. False ideas about the past, about the present, about current struggles that people are facing on reservations and elsewhere. And not only that, U.S. pop culture has done a really good job spreading these false narratives, these baseless myths in books, and westerns, you name it. The other day I was walking down Broadway in Jackson and saw this fortune teller-like machine with a stereotypically Native guy inside. I just couldn't resist. I had to record it. It was so cringy. I fed my dollar in, and...
You'd my words, for I am great medicine man, with words of wisdom from the all-knowing spirits of Mother Earth. You cannot wake person who pretending to sleep. And you, do not slumber, but see world around you. So go out and make the most of today. See world. Find love.
Okay, we get it. The point is, most of these on-the-surface stories don't talk about actual, real Native people at all. And when Native people are talked about, it's mostly in the past tense, in a romanticized or tokenized way, or in a super oversimplified way.
Yeah, exactly. The first of these super pervasive stories that people subscribe to in this country is this shared understanding that Native folks exist only in the past, that they've somehow disappeared. I grew up in New York, and until about 5th grade, we learned a ton about the Algonquin and the Mohawk people, and then just sort of stopped. Like, when things would have gotten real, we stopped.
And all that being said, we do want to take a step back and recognize that there are so many excellent Native reporters, news platforms, artists, and activists working to counter this glossing over by instead elevating the stories of Native communities and Native people. And we're excited to share some of their work with you at the end of the show.
Hey, Han, going back to something you said earlier in the intro, you mentioned we were going to be talking about Indigenous pasts and Indigenous presents. Did you mean that? Like, was the plural intentional?
Good question. It was intentional. That's myth number 2. Another big misconception we're dealing with here is that all Native people are, in some way, all the same or very, very similar. But there's really no such thing as one Indigenous or Native American story in the US, or anywhere for that matter. As of December 2019, there are 574 different tribal nations federally recognized by the US government, with the Little Shell Chippewa Nation in Montana becoming the 574th just over a month ago. There are also many more tribes that are unrecognized by the federal government, some of which are recognized by state governments, and some of which are not recognized at all. Each of these tribal nations are different, distinct, and culturally unique political entities. To make things even more complex, individuals can be part of many tribal nations, but can only be recognized as part of one by the federal government. Nor is there such a thing as one Indigenous or Native American story in Wyoming, or the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. 26 tribes have historically occupied or claim association with the land that is now Yellowstone National Park. The 2 reservations closest to Jackson are the Wind River Reservation, about 2 hours to the east, which is the present-day home of the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone peoples, as well as the Fort Hall Reservation, just 150 miles southwest of here, south of Pocatello, Idaho, home to the Shoshone-Bannock people.
Yeah, and how these tribal nations ended up on reservations in the first place is a big, messy, complicated, and very painful story in and of itself. But before we go there, let's go back in time a little bit, and right here to the Tetons.
The Teton Range is part of the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone people. The Shoshone called the range Pt.1, meaning many pinnacles, a name which has been cast aside in favor of the name brought in by French fur trappers, les 3 Tetons, meaning the 3 breasts.
Well, that's kind of fratty.
Yeah, I agree. Wouldn't it have been easier to just keep the Shoshone name? Now only one peak in the range bears the name Pt.1.
But enough from us. In archival audio pulled from a lecture in 1992 at the Teton County Historical Society, Shoshone Métis judge and activist Clyde Hall explained some of the histories of the Shoshone-Bannock people and the difficulty of keeping those histories alive.
But for the most part, as I started on this little spiel here, it's up to speculation. A lot of people do not know, even Indian people, how they lived before white contact. It's something that's been forgotten. It's something that really hasn't been passed on. Another difficulty is the reconstruction of the prehistory. In the prehistory of the tribe is the name Fort Hall Shoshone-Bannock. For one thing, we don't call ourselves that. It comes from reservation times, and most people think of it as being a one group, and it really has now. It has become one group. But at one time, as Wynn said in his book, there was many different bands of Shoshone, and of course the Bannock. The Bannock's original name is Bannockwi, which means I dwell by the water. And of course the Shoshone is Nuwa meaning the people, the true people of this earth. And of course there's different bands. There was about 7 different bands of Shoshone that ranged anywhere from here in Wyoming on the plains, such as the Guchudika, the Agaidika, the Salmon Eaters up in Salmon River country, the Tudika or the Sheep Eater, the Yahandika, or Rock Chuck Eater, and so forth. And the more confusing thing is that, of course, these people traveled in a big circle, going from food source to food source. And so whatever they happened to be gathering at that time, there were that kind of people. There's the Bruno Valley Shoshone people who lived in the Boise area. All these people, about 7 different bands of Shoshone, were either agreed or were forced to come to Fort Hall, such as the Bruno Valley Shoshone. They 100 years ago were farmers. They had peach trees and were very much integrated into the settlers' culture. When it was decreed that the Indian people were all to live at Fort Hall, they were forced marched by the soldiers to reside in Fort Hall. They had no choice. They were herded up by them, given less than 24 hours to pack what they could. Their peach trees were chopped down, and they were sent to Fort Hall.
Huh. It's interesting that there were so many bands of Shoshone and that they organized culture around natural resources, that like identity was formed around food.
Honestly, the image of the peach trees being chopped down is really disturbing to me. It makes me pretty sad. Like, even the groups of Shoshone who had started integrating into a more white settler lifestyle were forced to go to the reservation, and so abruptly and being marched. Let's hear a little more.
In contemporary times, it's very difficult to try to reconstruct primitive culture. And my people, the Gwich'in-Dika, Idaho's buffalo hunting Shoshone, of course, we gave up for most purposes our political independence in 1860 through the treaties of 1863 and 1868, where we voluntarily congregated on a reservation, or some people involuntarily congregated on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, as well as Fort Washakie in Wyoming. We're known as the Eastern and Western bands of Shoshone, the Wind River people being the Eastern band, and the Fort Hall people being the Western band of Shoshone. One thing that most people don't know is that our economic independence had pretty much been undermined in one form or the other starting in the 1840s, because that's when the buffalo disappeared from Fort Hall, from the Fort Hall area that was called woods buffalo. That's the time when the Shoshone culture, being before that an independent, free superorganism, it came to a conclusion.
Some pretty heavy stuff. An entire culture, or way of relating to the world, coming to an end.
Yeah. And all of this is part of a larger story of erasure of tribal nations in the U.S. by the U.S. that's been happening since white settlers arrived. And the displacement, erasure, and outright destruction of these nations in the U.S. has largely been written out of U.S. history, or has been really downplayed.
So that's myth 3. This collective sense that what we're talking about here really wasn't genocide. It was. We're recording this on the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which is what Americans are taught to think of when they hear the word genocide. But in 1948, the Western world agreed on 5 criteria that define a genocide, and the United States treatment of indigenous people on this continent fits all 5.
It's not a pretty part of U.S. history. In fact, it's downright ugly. But that doesn't make it any less true or any less important.
Well, it's certainly true, but whether it's important depends on the United States' interest in just being honest.
This genocide looked like violence, murder, and massacre. It looked like, as Clyde said, people being forced to pack up their lives and relocate at the drop of the hat. It looked like a withholding of essential resources, the eradication of bison, and separating families. It looked like abducting young people to boarding schools where they were forced to assimilate into white culture and weren't allowed to speak their native language. It was the destruction of traditional oral histories and the writing out of native stories from our country's dominant history.
In exchange for federally recognized rights and reservation land, many tribes ended up ceding huge swaths of land to the United States government through treaties, but these reservations were just a sliver of the original tribal land and were far from perfect. For instance, some members of the same tribal nation, like the Shoshones, were split into different reservations, fracturing communities. As is the case with the Wind River Reservation, sometimes groups who had historically been in conflict with one another ended up on the same reservation, like the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho.
And all that land that was ceded to the U.S. government? Lots of it was given to white settlers to develop and support westward expansion, but lots of it became what is now commonly thought of as public land. Public land was framed as land that was unused, free for the taking, but in reality, the whole idea of land free for the taking was only made possible by the removal of Indian people.
Yeah, and that land includes the land that's now Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. There's this little book called Dispossessing the Wilderness, and in it, there's this scene where after the government creates Yellowstone Park and promotes it to rich folks as the sort of wilderness tourist destination, where man is supposed to be a visitor, tourists from New York are showing up, and as they are, people from various tribes are still out there trying to hunt and walking down these newly created roads, and the white people from the coast just don't know how to act. By the government, they were told that the land was unused, and yet when they got there, the public was seeing that it wasn't.
Yeah, it's totally the narrative when people say, oh, there was no one here, or there's never been anyone here before. And most of the time, that's not really true. And all of these social and political injustices continue to impact Native communities and the governance of reservations today. There's a lot of hardship and also a lot of incredible resilience as these communities advocate for their cultures in the present. Here, Clyde speaks to this continual reinvention and adaptability.
There's one thing I should tell you about Indian culture is it's always changing. I always laugh at people when they come to Fort Hall during the festival, the second weekend of August, and they say, oh, this is such wonderful, you Indians are preserving your culture and you're doing things like you did 100 years ago and everything. And I look at them and I say, well, it's nice you think that, but we're pretty contemporary people. Because a culture really, in some respects, has never died. It goes on and on and on, from generation to generation. And in each generation, it's interpreted in new ways and in new forms. And that's the way it remains a living culture.
Coming up next, we'll take a look at how Indian law has been interpreted in new ways and in new forms from generation to generation. Support for Yonder Lies comes from Wildlife Expeditions of Teton Science Schools. For over 20 years, Wildlife Expeditions has been leading educational wildlife tours in Jackson Hole, Grand Teton, and Yellowstone National Parks. To see wildlife and support education, visit wildlifeexpeditions.org.
Even here in Jackson Hole, there is this often repeated story that Indigenous folks just weren't here. And this is just simply not true. And it's so much not true that conflict between Indigenous folks and white settlers grew and grew here into a tension that would eventually result in a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case about the relationship between states' rights and treaty rights.
Here's Clyde Hall explaining an incident in Jackson that set this chain of events into motion.
And of course, this was always a area where my people loved to come to fish and hunt. Especially during the summer, we loved it here just like everyone else. And we made certain bands of people made their homes here. In fact, up until 1890s, we would come here and hunt and fish and that until some very nasty people decided that we couldn't do that anymore, and they arrested a band of people and threw them in the city of Jackson jail. I don't know whether any of you know about that. Well, look it up. And that was a real interesting case because we were claiming that we were exercising our hunting and fishing rights under the Fort Bridger Treaty that gave us exclusive right to hunt on unoccupied lands owned by the government or controlled by the government, and of which this area of Jackson, for the most part, still was. But we were arrested for trespassing and illegal hunting. And in fact, it was quite a nasty scene. I think there were some people shot during it. And the government represented us, incidentally, in this case. We lost. So much for that.
The sentiment against Indians hunting in Jackson Hole would eventually snowball into the famous 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case, which also originated in Wyoming. Ward against Racehorse.
And I know what you might be thinking. Oh man, law. How boring. But look, law is basically just a string of very serious promises between governments and individuals. In this case, it's about promises between three of the most important governing bodies in the United States: tribal nations, state governments, and the federal government. It's about who gets to do what on whose land. And so one way to understand this series of cases is a series of broken promises. The first promise in this drama was made between the tribal nations and the federal government. In the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868, the federal government promised the Shoshone and Bannock people certain rights, one of which was, quote, the right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States so long as game may be found thereon, end quote. And although this may seem fairly straightforward, what unoccupied lands means is what ends up making this promise complicated. Support for Yonder Lies comes from Think WY, Wyoming Humanities. Wyoming Humanities supports programs, grants, and initiatives in Teton County and across Wyoming that explore history, culture, and the human experience. To learn more about the Wyoming Humanities Council, visit thinkwy.org. Again, that's thinkwy.org.
In 1895, the governor of Wyoming and Jackson residents were interested in testing the definition of unoccupied lands. And so they found a Bannock leader named Racehorse to volunteer to kill elk in Wyoming and submit himself to authorities so that the issue could go to court. The Wyoming folks contended that all land within the state of Wyoming was occupied, and so the earlier treaty would no longer apply, again because the fulfillment of the treaty hinged on unoccupied land. It became a question of interpretation. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896, and Wyoming won. The Supreme Court said that because Wyoming was a state, the land was occupied, both legally and functionally, and therefore the federal treaty right to hunt game on traditional hunting grounds was overruled by the power of the state.
So the promise between the federal government and the tribal nations was broken. State governments could regulate the hunting and fishing of native people outside of reservations on state and federal lands.
Still confused? That's okay. Honestly, there's a lot to wade through. Luckily, we've got someone here to help us out.
I'm Gerald Torres. I'm on the faculty of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. I'm also a member of the Yale Law School faculty. The war against racehorse had almost, it was clearly an anti-tribal, anti-Indian decision, and thus the state could regulate the taking, hunting, and fishing outside of the reservation boundaries.
So what happened next?
Well, more than 100 years passed. The decision in Ward against Racehorse set a precedent which limited the power of treaty rights across the country. Then there was another Supreme Court case in 1999, which focused on the off-reservation hunting and fishing rights of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota. The main question of the case was this: should federal treaty rights actually have been set aside when Minnesota became a state?
What Mille Lacs decided for purposes of war against racehorse was that the treaty rights that were guaranteed to the Mille Lacs Band survived the entry of Minnesota into the Union. So it set up a conflict with war against racehorse at that point. And many people thought, although the court case did not explicitly say, but many people thought that the Mille Lacs case essentially overruled racehorse.
And then fast forward to 2019, when the U.S. Supreme Court finally got explicit. Just last year in the case Herrera against Wyoming, the Supreme Court ruled that actually, the 1868 treaty, the original promise made by the federal government to tribes, takes precedent over state law. The case involved a Crow man hunting in Bighorn National Forest out of season, according to the state of Wyoming. Herrera did two things. One, the ruling effectively overturned Ward against Racehorse and reaffirmed what was suggested by the Mille Lacs case. Treaty rights were still valid, even when states had entered the Union. Basically, Ward against Racehorse was bad law. Second, the case explicitly ruled that just because the land was owned by the federal government doesn't make it inherently occupied, and therefore treaty rights still applied.
And the answer the court gave was no, that the mere ownership of the land by the federal government, and especially occupied so to exclude settlement, right, because that's what it did in the parkland, meant that the land was still open as contemplated by the treaty, and thus the state would be precluded from exercising its hunting and fishing rules in that territory over Indian people. I wanted people in the West to think about this. It's to think about the existence of different legal regimes and people being governed by different legal regimes. So it's not as though the tribes occupy some kind of free space. They occupy a space that is legally guaranteed to them. And these are legal rights. They're legal rights that arose out of the history of the expansion of the United States West and the rights that were bargained for in order to eliminate direct conflict between the tribes and non-tribal people. The task in front of us, I think, is for the states, the tribes, and the federal government to reach an understanding of how they will coexist in these potentially conflicted spaces. And it's a process that we continue to work through day after day, and there's space for a reasoned resolution as opposed to just conflict.
I really appreciate the note Gerald ends on about coexistence and reaching some sort of collaborative resolution. It's fascinating to learn more about how the treaty rights of tribes interact with the law, and to remember that tribal nations are legally sovereign bodies according to the U.S. Constitution, and to know that anti-Indian sentiment in Wyoming led to tribal treaty rights being legally ignored for over 100 years. We're dealing with the legacy of broken promises. But the ruling in Herrera seems like one small, hopeful instance in which those promises are being reconciled with legally, restored in some way.
Yeah, and going back to our first episode, talking about the creation of Grand Teton National Park, it's important to remember that that land was once Bannock and Shoshone land. And even the idea of wilderness in sort of the American mind, the idea that there are these places that are pure and free of people, that are untrammeled, is all predicated on assuming that Indigenous folks weren't there, which is just basically not true. We've talked about some myths that exist around Native folks, from the narrative that Native folks only exist in history, to the idea that they're all the same people, to the story that this wasn't really a genocide, and that they never really lived here in Jackson Hole. All of these stories are untrue.
We've talked about the Bannock and Shoshone who lived in Jackson Hole and the creation of reservations. We've touched on the legal juggle between tribes, states, and the federal government when it comes to Native hunting rights.
So, Han, now that we've gone through all that, what are you left thinking about?
I'm left thinking about a lot. Recording this episode has been hard and has pushed me to think a lot about stories I was told growing up and believed. Stories that made me buy into a lot of these false narratives about Native folks we've mentioned earlier. And it feels really important both to name that and also to start undoing it, through learning and reflection and conversation like this.
Yeah, it makes me think about conversations I've had about this topic in the past with other white people from the dominant Western culture here in the United States. And what I've noticed in those conversations is that it oftentimes ends up on two polarized ends of understanding this. Either, on one hand, I'm an individual, I wasn't part of this history, so I'm not really responsible for what happened in the past, to, oh my gosh, I was the one that committed genocide, and now I'm completely emotionally crushed by this realization and almost incapable of doing anything about it. And I don't think either of those sort of polarized narratives is useful in actually rectifying the wrongs of the present.
Yeah, I agree. And with that being said, we hope that everyone listening comes away from this episode a little more curious and a little more compassionate. We hope it's left you with a lot of questions and hopefully lots to think about. We hope everyone tries to keep learning about this topic. Here are 3 books we'd encourage folks to check out: Black Elk Speaks, An Indigenous People's History of the U.S., and Dispossessing the Wilderness. We'd also recommend checking out 3 great Native news platforms: Indian Country Today, Native News Online, and Indigenizing the News.
Our next episode will explore more contemporary issues facing Indigenous communities today, and will be coming out next Sunday, February 9th.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Technical support comes from Jackson's community radio station, KHOL 89.1, and the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative. A big thanks to the Jackson Hole Historical Society for providing access to hours of archival audio. Special shout out to Doug Haberman for our theme music and Becca Holt-Hewson for our beautiful cover art.
If you haven't already, please rate and subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. And if you'd like to support the show with a small monthly donation, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/yonderlies. That's patreon.com/yonderlies.